Hi, welcome back. In today's lesson, we will cover the essentials of color correction and color grading in Premiere Pro and what are the best practices for your CA. The topics that will be covered would be Lumetri scopes, Lumetri color adjustment layer. So let's start with a new project and import the working files. You should see three folders: color graded video, non-lock videos, S-Log2 videos. Now, what is the difference between color correction and grading? Color correction is meant to fix color and exposure of a clip or a series of clips, while color grading is meant to add atmosphere and emotion of the video or film to give the audience a sense of time and space of the story. Before we jump into it, let's go to the color workspace. There are two key panels that you need to know before applying color correction and grading. They are Lumetri scope and Lumetri color. Let's drag all the non-lock clips to the timeline. By default, you should see a Lumetri scope that's different from mine. So what we should be doing is that go to the wrench here, under settings, please enable vector scope YUV, and under waveform, by default, it has been set to RGB. Please select Luma. Once that is done, one more step is to select the color workspace to Rec 709. Now let me walk you through how to read the waveform and vector scope. As I'm scrubbing the playhead on the timeline, if you to eyeball to the waveform, it shows the change in grayscale value when the off-white trashback moves in frame, while the vector scope shows shifting of color values to red when appearance of the head. The grayscale values in the waveform are conformed to a scale, and 0 indicates black point, 255 indicates white point. And when you see the waveform flattens on either side, it means that values has been clipped. The reason why the value for white point is 255 is because of the 8-bit. Vector scope YUV display color values in the image under the playhead, where the angle of the pixel represents the hue and the distance up from the center represents the amount of saturation. Pixels at the center of the vector scope are gray, and the color hue starts with red in the top left and rotating clockwise transition to magenta, to blue, to cyan, to green, to yellow, and back to red. So now let me introduce the Lumetri color. Under the Lumetri color panel, you will see basic correction, creative, curves, color wheels and match, HSL, and Bitmap. Let's start with basic correction. Under basic correction, you have an input LUT here, and it offers various presets of camera, brands, LUT table. You can choose any one of them to have a sense of the so-called settings in terms of colors, if it suits your needs. If not, then you can place at none. Next is the white balance. Under the white balance, you can manually change the values by making more warm. I want you to eyeball on the vector scope as well. As I shift, you'll notice that the hue changes on the vector scope as well, and the saturation changes as well. If it's more bluish, then the highlighted area will shift more to the blue area. And to show the saturation, the longer the so-called highlighted area will be so-called wider spread in terms. If you decided not to use this value, you can double click on the indicator. Next is the tinting. Tinting, basically, you can shift the tinting to make it more greenish or magenta, but however, I usually don't use that because it requires certain accuracy. On this note, I just want to share that all editor suites, they are usually a room whereby they have neutral colors. That means they don't have yellow wall, red wall, etc. They are usually either gray wall, 18% gray, and the monitors are calibrated. So they have precision in terms of color correction and color grading. But if you do not have the luxury of a neutral background, we will depend on the vector scope and the Luma to make sure our correction and grading is well done. Okay, of course, in the white balance, you have this eyedropper. You can select the eyedropper, click on anywhere. If you hold down the mouse, you move around anywhere, they can actually have a sense of what kind of white balance. Basically, you are doing a custom white balance. What you should be looking at is areas that represent neutral color. For example, white, gray, black, but not color values. Color values will give you an off white balance. Next off is the tone. How do we correct the tone? First off, if you look at the Luma waveform, there's a clipping on top. So my suggestion is always look for highlight clippings. If there are highlight clippings, what you need to do is to move the highlights and the whites. So what we are doing is to recover the highlights. The reverse is that if there are clippings in the blacks, then you use shadow and blacks to recover shadow. But for this case, we don't have. I'm going to open up the shadow and the blacks as well. So you notice after I move all these 4 parameters is that the waveform has come within the values of 0 and 255. And this is what we want to achieve. Next off, of course, we will move our midtones, which is the exposure. And the last one we're going to touch on is the contrast. Of course, you can also apply saturation here, but I advise not to because saturation applied here is across the whole footage. And if you decided not to use any of this setting, you can always reset. Now I'm going to touch on creative. So under creative itself, they have another lookup table. If you press here, you have a list of lookup tables for you to choose from. But however, it's not appearing due to my screen resolution. Over this display here, you can see the arrows. Basically, if you were to click the arrow, the lookup table will appear. So basically, if you decided to use this, and you can double click on the screen here, it will be applied to the video footage. And how much intensity do you need to apply? You can adjust the intensity and it will appear on the screen. All this lookup table here is a fast and easy way to correct the colors that you wish to mimic. Press the arrow here and you continue with a list of different lookup tables. Under adjustment, you can also use what we call faded film if you want to, and use sharpen, vibrance, and saturation. But however, I usually do not use this. Next I'm going to introduce is the curves. So under curves is similar to basic correction except that they have less control. The bottom part of it is the shadow. This is the midtones, and this is the highlights. Of course, you can put in small incremental of keyframes. Basically, if I were to move down some, the shadow will increase. If I move the other end, up north, then the shadow will be open. If you don't like to enter values, then of course you can come here to adjust it. And if you can double click, it goes back to the linear curve. And if you select red, then of course they'll only adjust the red band. And green for the green band. Blue for the blue band. Personally, I don't use this as well unless required. So next, I want to introduce something that's more interesting and offers much more control. This is called the Hue Saturation curves. Basically, what you're doing now is to adjust the saturation based on the hue value. You can use the eyedropper again to select the portion that you wish to enhance based on saturation. If I were to select the yellow, then the indicator, they will shortlist for you 3 points. So what you are interested in is to move the midpoint of that 3 keyframes. As I move, you can see the colors of red. When I move up north, becomes more saturated. And I move down soft, it becomes less saturated. And double click again, you go reset back to 0. Of course, you can do multiple. For example, I can click on the blue and also click on the yellow. So basically the multiple areas, you can do that. So you can enhance the blue here. So it's a very good tool for you just to enhance certain color values in terms of saturation. Next is the hue versus hue. What it means is that with the selection of a target hue, change the colors on the go. Again, using the color picker, here the yellow. And as I click on the center point of the 3 keyframes, you notice the line that is created as I hold down the mouse. It gives you different color values. It means from the yellow point that I have, if I shift up north, I can change it to pink and to blue. If I shift down south, it can change to green. But again, do be careful. We also affect the adjacent colors. So next one would be hue versus luma. What it means is that under the selected hue, how can you enhance the brightness? So select again, if I have to select yellow. And this time round, the vertical line gives you only brightness or darkness. Next one would be luma versus saturation. What this means is that if I have to select this again, under this brightness, I can enhance the saturation. This is what I'm going to do. I can decrease the brightness for that saturation. This is what it means. You are targeting on certain brightness, but you're enhancing either the saturation or decreasing the saturation for that part. Same thing, the last one will be saturation versus saturation. Basically, what it does is that if I have to select here again, now I select the blue. I've selected this saturation, and I'm going to enhance further for that particular saturation. So that means I'll not touch other blues except for that blue, or I can desaturate it here for this particular blue. So that's all for the curves. Color wheels match. This is how it works. You can double click on it. You'll see something new again. You have color match, comparison, view, face detection. What is all this? So basically what I'm doing now is that since these 3 footage are non-lock, I've decided to reference to a graded footage. So basically, if I like this apply match, they will apply to this clip that I've selected. And after you apply, and if you think that you need to further enhance it, so there are 3 color wheels here. So I can open up my shadow brightness by moving this slider. Open up my midtones using this slider. Again, the sliders are all for the luma. And then the highlights. Then now I can bring down my shadow. Then the midtones, bring it up again. The sliders are meant for you to adjust the luma, the brightness and darkness. The color wheel itself is for you to change the color values of the shadow, midtones, and all that. Okay, so you can move a little bit. This is what you can do with color wheels and match, which is quite easy to use and good to use. I can also quickly apply to here as well. I just apply match. So let's say, for example, I've applied certain correction here. And Premiere is really smart. It offers you to actually save this effect. So basically, you have created, and it's called Lumetri color. Whatever parameters you have shifted, it's called Lumetri color, but it can be confusing. So the best is, if you intend to have a lot of color correction, I suggest that you can rename it. Let's call it the basic correction. Once you apply that, you can always enable and disable to see the effect. This sums up the basic correction. If you have shot most of the video clips on non-lock, you decided to do a color grading for the non-lock. What is the technique to it? As you can see, footages that are shot with non-lock, they are rather difficult to make them same feel and look because their contrast has been clipped. Let me introduce this thing called the adjustment layer. So you go under the project panel, under new item, look for an adjustment layer. Press OK, drag and drop and put on top of the video clips that you are going to affect. What we need to do now is to prepare the non-lock videos so that they are gradable. So everything has been reset. The tip to color grading non-lock videos is this. Basically, every single clip that I have here, the contrast is really high. I need to make the contrast low so that it becomes more gradable. First, I'll decrease my saturation to about 70%. And then I open up my blacks to about 30%. And I open up my shadow to another 30% as well. Okay. And I'm going to create my contrast to be about minus, say, 30% as well. With this parameter set, in order to apply to the rest of, so let me introduce something called copy and paste attribute. Right click, copy, and then select the adjacent tracks by using the Command plus Shift. Right click, and then paste attributes. Once that is done, make sure you only select Lumetri color. It should look similar, slightly off contrast. So I'm going to apply certain colors, also called lookup table, to this adjustment layer. How do I do it? I can either apply using the basic correction, any of these inputs here, or if I decided not to, I can use a creative and I just move along to see which is more suitable. So basically, after I apply, okay, it looks a bit too much, back down a little bit. Actually, I've color graded the whole film. They look the same. If let's say any of one looks too bright, what you should be doing is that go down to that particular clip, go back to your basic correction. We have entered 30, for example, most of them. So if I need to open up the exposure slightly, I'll just open up. When you do your preparation for lock, it should not be clipped. So what I'm going to do is, for this case, I'm going to bring it down a little bit so that it is falling within 255 and 0. Same for this is okay. And this one, I'm going to bring it down back a little bit to make sure it's within the range. Then when you start grading, everything will look much more better. So when you turn on the grading, then the luma will also increase a little bit. So make sure the luma does not exceed 255. Then you are good. So this sums up how to do color grading for non-lock. These 3 footages has been shot in lock. So I can, based on this adjustment layer, drag and drop over. When you do your preparation for lock, you must ensure the clips do not clip. I do not need to do the desaturation anymore. When you shoot in lock, they already have that dynamic range. I just need to ensure my waveform is below 255. So what I'm going to do now is I just need to select either from the basic correction input LUT, or I can go to creative, double click, apply. For this clip, it seems to be a little bit muted, also called the exposure a bit dark. I'm going to adjust that particular clip to be brighter. That's all. So that's the reason why when you start shooting, right, your exposure has to be consistent. Then when you do color grading, it's much more easier. And maybe this one slightly toned down to increase our exposure. You can see the feel and look is the same. So please bear in mind is that for S-Log footages, exposure must be consistent. Make sure it doesn't clip so much. Then when you do your color grading, it will be much easier. All right. So although I've already chosen one of the LUT to change the color of this clothing to another color, I can use the hue versus hue, or I need to select the picker. Then I can change it to another color. So that can be done. Okay. So basically, all the 4 panels here is up to you how you combine and use it. Of course, you need some experiences. So I hope this lesson is useful, and have a good time playing with color grading and color correction.